All right, hello and welcome back to another exciting fireside chat. I'm your host, Brandon Lovejoy, and today I'm joined by Areg Harapetian, who is the Director of Engineering at the EOS Network Foundation and also the Principal Architect of Savanna, the new consensus algorithm for EOS. Also joining us here is Zach Gall, CCO of the EOS Network Foundation. Glad to have you. All right, let's just dive right in. Zach, do you wanna say anything exciting? You get a big smile on your face.
No, I'm just happy to have Arig here, honestly. So this has been a long process to ship Spring and then hard fork the EOS network. For the last 6 months or so, as we were building up to the launch, we were given strict instructions not to bother the engineering team
That's
because
right.
this is just such a major workload and with deadlines that we had to hit. We had some moving deadlines. We had a couple of delays. Then we set a final deadline that was basically, say, do or die for September. And this is the first time, I guess last week was the first time we did a Twitter space. We were recording this, that Arig joined us. But this is really the first call that we've been on like this in quite some time. So I'm pretty excited.
That's right. Yeah, it's very, very good to have you, Areg. I'm glad you're finally able to make some public appearances.
Yeah, I'm glad too. And so heads down in developing Savanna and Spring. It's finally good to actually come up for air and talk about it. Really excited.
Cool. So let's dive right in. Spring 1.0 was recently released on September 25th. That network successfully hard forked to Spring 1.0. Maybe you could just give us the bird's eye view of what that was like, how it went. Then we'll get into like a little bit of the background leading up to it after that.
Sure. So basically, well, it was very fun and intense experience in terms of the development of it. This last basically year, I guess I could back up a little bit and talk about how we got here. But so we started off. At this point, was it? I think maybe 2 years ago. I honestly lost track of time. Deciding, okay, it's time for us to upgrade our consensus algorithm. EOS has had this unnamed consensus algorithm. I just call it Legacy Consensus, and it worked well for many years, but it did have some flaws, and particularly the most noticeable is this. I don't know how noticeable this is, but it definitely bugged me. Is this time to finality, where it's scaled with the number of block producers you have. So with 21 block producers on EOS, that was 3 minutes based on how that worked. And I knew for a long while like we could get that way down using certain techniques in the literature. And so it was time. It's time to upgrade the algorithm. So we started with a different process of putting out the specifications of what we wanted in this new algorithm. I've been thinking about it for a while. I'm like, I want to have this property, these properties, these properties, these properties. So kind of put that out there for people to bid on to work on that. And while we're focused on other things in the protocol and on EOS to develop on. And then we started that process, but then we realized at some point along the way that this is really hard work. Like this is both very difficult on the theoretical side, but also very difficult in practically integrating it into the code base. Like you've got to be an expert in our code, previously called Leap, now called Spring, this implementation, to figure out how to properly integrate it without all kinds of bugs and other issues. So that's when we got basically most of the company involved in creating this team led by me to basically to build this thing we're calling is the Finality, and then later got the name, a proper name for it called Savanna, and then build it into the software that we ended up calling Spring and releasing it as Spring 1.0 just earlier last month for the stable version. So that process, until basically September from a year prior was basically me and several of the engineers at the ENF, but also Guillaume outside of the ENF, and of course Kevin Effner, which basically, I mean, he's from his partner in OCI that has been part of the code base working on
basically
EOS.
full time on, and he's a contractor full time on
before
our
it was launched. So basically part of working with us very, very close to the ENF. So this team, we came together and we've met. Well, it changed over time, but for the last several months, I've lost count again. We've been meeting multiple times a week for many hour meetings where you get really, it was very interesting. Like you get really into design discussions and whiteboard sessions. And again, like I said, lots of fun, also a lot of work, lots of pretty stressful too. But through that process, we iterated on this many times, and we got to a much better end result than I even anticipated. Originally when we were laying out the specifications of what we wanted. So I could talk more about that process and actually what we achieved.
So I guess we could mention the improvement. So I don't know the exact percentage. I can't do the math, but the original finality time was quite long. So it was roughly 3 minutes for absolute finality with the previous release. But at the same time, so 3 minutes sounds extremely long. From what I understand, it was like 99% final after a couple of blocks, but to be 100% final would have been 3 minutes, which is quite long. So the improvement here is now 1 second, 2 blocks.
Yeah, I can give a little background on finality and blockchain, so this can make a little more sense. But so there's some consensus. There's some blockchains where the consensus algorithm is probabilistic finality. They don't ever actually have finality. So Bitcoin is the classic example. You could revert all the way back to Genesis in theory. In practice, that's not going to happen. And there's reasons you could argue that's not going to happen because of the algorithm and because of the economics behind the algorithm. But there's no guarantee that a block is final based on some algorithm. We can say it's absolutely final. And then there's calculations people do saying like, well, when it's 5 blocks deep, this is the probability of it being reverted, 6 blocks deep, 20 blocks deep, whatever. And you can say you choose how deep you want to go based on the probability you feel comfortable with, which is actually kind of cool. That's subjective like that, where based on the probability threshold, you choose how long you want to wait before you consider this block and the transactions within them final. But one thing to keep in mind with these sort of probability models is like, okay, but what are your assumptions, right? Like there's always these assumptions. There's always this model you have to have of like, we think it's this difficult to do this. And it comes into tricky things like economics, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, how cheap is it? I mean, if I invented this new thing that could do hashing, 1 million times faster, that totally changes all the assumptions of what the likelihood is of what I would call a finality violation, where you have 2 different branches that are both considered final by different entities, different partitions in the network. That's bad. So what is the probability of that? Well, it depends on lots of things in your assumptions in your model. So then there's this idea of, I don't know what the name is, but I've heard it be called, and I sometimes call it absolute finality or algorithmic finality, where there's always assumptions, but it's kind of mathematically cleaner. You could say, assuming these pretty concrete assumptions that have nothing to do with economics holds, then I could say that when this algorithm says this is final, this block is final, there are certain properties that hold that you could count on. Now, you can't ever, it's just impossible to ever say it will never be reverted, or in other words, there will never be a finality violation, 2 conflicting blocks that are considered final. That's impossible. But what you can do is say, if that were to happen, this is the other consequence of that. And then you could reason from there based on, again, models of economics and all this other behavior to say, how likely is that? But that kind of hard computer science guarantees of if this happens, under these assumptions, if this bad thing happens, then these other things have also necessarily happened, which helps you reason about the deterrence properties of this. That is something that you need a algorithm that has like this algorithmic or absolute finality to have, whereas Bitcoin, doesn't have that, for example. So on EOS, we had that algorithmic finality that, like after a certain point, this is marked final, and it has certain implications that you could leverage to justify why you could believe that block won't be reverted. But there's also other, in your model, you can also say but there's other reasons why I could say earlier block won't be reverted. It goes back again to these sort of game theoretic assumptions of, okay, what would have to happen for that to happen? What is the incentive of the people who have the ability to do that to make that happen? For example, you would have to have a fork where BP doesn't build on this block. Okay, but what are the chances of that happening? Well, if it's an honest mistake, it's because the blocks were delayed in propagating by a certain amount of time. That could happen, but what's the likelihood of that happening? Or maybe they intentionally decided not to build on it because they're being malicious for some reason. Okay, what's the likelihood of that happening? These are hard to answer, but so I can't give you a precise probability measurement of what is the chances of, in the old algorithm of, if you have two blocks, or you have a block with two blocks building on top of it, what is the probability that a block will be reverted? You can't give a precise mathematical answer to that because it's based on lots of assumptions about human behavior. But in practice, and this way we say, is it 98? Is it 99? We don't know, but it's a really high number. It's close to 100%. It seems in practice that these things are not going to be reverted. Just a few blocks deep, but you don't have those mathematical guarantees of that until you wait a lot longer, the 3 minutes. And so what we want to do is get those mathematical guarantees down to 1 second.
Which you've achieved with Savanna.
Yeah, and you mentioned the mathematical proofs to get to finality. So Areg was also one of the original core engineers of what was originally called EOS.io, so the original EOS software that launched mainnet in 2018. And from what I understand, because of, I guess, the rush to launch, there were just certain things that didn't happen that you would have liked to have happened. And so how did you, and part of it is, I guess you weren't in charge then, you were part of the team, important part of the team, but you weren't making all of the decisions, whereas this time you and Bart had clearly a lot more control over how this launch occurred. So you want to kind of go into a little bit of detail of what was lacking in the original launch and how you did it differently this time. Sure.
And I'm not saying that was the wrong decision at the time, because there's these practical considerations, right? You have to launch the chain by a certain time. People, there's all these considerations. People want to see their tokens become liquid and start using stuff. So we had this deadline, June, and it was closely approaching. So first, let me back up. There's consensus algorithms out in the literature, right? But a lot of them aren't Byzantine fault tolerant. They just are crash fault tolerant. And even some of them that are Byzantine fault tolerant, they don't get all the little pieces that you need in practice for what we need in the blockchain space. So for example, many of them don't even talk about how you change the set of replicas. So they set up here's the replicas, it's given to you, and here's the proofs of how this is Byzantine fault tolerant. It tolerates up to F faults, and they could go down, they could be malicious, and the consensus works. Great. So how do I change one of these replicas? But how do I remove one of them and replace them with another one? How do I do that safely? I mean, some might talk about it, but others in the literature don't talk about it. So you got to figure that out. Okay, so now you're talking about a different algorithm already. And then there might be some optimizations you want. The original legacy consensus algorithm did a smart thing, which is also in the literature. I'm pretty sure we weren't aware of it at the time, and it's become more popular since. But this idea of pipelining is very valuable. The idea that you have multiple consensus requires multiple stages, typically of consensus, I guess, to be secure, and so for example, let's say it's 2 phases. You have the proposal, you get a first phase on it, and then you get the second phase on it, and now you're good, for example. And there's other ones that might require 3 phases, like Hot Stuff does. I'll talk more about that. Hot Stuff was the sort of inspiration originally of what the consensus algorithm was, even though as we iterated on it, we improved on it, I'd say. Anyway, you have these multiple phases, but at the same time, you're getting new proposals. Proposals in this case, you could think of as blocks, right? So every half second on EOS, we get a new proposal. And so you want to make a 2-phase round trip on a block, but then you got to do it for the next one, and the next one, and next one. It does take time for messages to be sent across the network, validated, to come back, right? It's not, there's a speed of light, but also there's other factors, like it takes time to validate these messages, the signatures on it. That's a critical part. And there's multiple hops as you jump from node to node, so that delays things. And so one smart thing is instead of doing these 2 phases or 3 phases per proposal, and then again for another one, and again for another one, you pipeline it. So you do 1 phase on this proposal, 1 phase on this proposal, 1 phase on this proposal, but this one serves triple duty, let's say on a 3-phase commit, of it acts as the 3rd phase of this proposal, it acts as the 2nd phase of that proposal, and acts as the 1st phase of that proposal. So you're amortizing the costs. That's a very smart thing to do. EOS, the legacy consensus did that, actually, but what it didn't do was aggregate all of the, I guess we're calling it votes, but you can call it there's different things you call it, but basically the responses by the replicas, in our nomenclature, the finalizers, the votes of the finalizers, saying like, yes, I'm committing to this block, or I'm helping progress consensus to the next phase for this block. Those votes, which come in the form of a signature, those are in the legacy consensus. We were doing 1 vote per block, so 1 vote per half second. That was part of the rule. You couldn't do it any faster than that, and there was a reason for that. We didn't want to have 21 or n, because in general, the protocol is designed to support n number of producers, not just 21. 21 is a choice EOS has made. We don't want to put all those signatures in every block. That gets very heavy every half second. It's a big burden on every node to capture that. And while more advanced cryptography already existed for aggregating these things, that was, as far as I remember, it's like that was fairly cutting edge for the blockchain space at the time, and wasn't well explored. And certainly there's already major risks, right? Doing some brand new smart contract platform, you don't want to do all kinds of other crazy crypto stuff too. But what we've done in Savanna is take advantage of this property in BLS signatures, the BLS crypto system, that allows you to take multiple signatures on the same message. It actually could be for different messages too, but in this case, we're saying multiple votes or signatures on the same message and combine them all together into one, so that you don't have to pay that cost. You don't have to have 21 votes in a block. You could have a single, what we call a quorum certificate signature in a block. And that not only saves space, but it's also critical for a property in consensus algorithms called linearity, which really helps with scalability. So I can talk a lot more about that, but I think, come back. We were talking about, if you could help remind me, Zach.
The mathematical proofs, how you could actually prove mathematically.
And what would I do different? Right. Yeah. So the rush to complete the original EOS protocol in time to launch the EOS network, you got to cut corners. You can't do everything, the way ideally you'd want to. So we had our custom consensus protocol that really was necessary. And again, it did some smart things like pipelining. There was pretty late in development of critical flaw found, right? Like the flaw required an extra phase of consensus, right, to be secured. And that then we kind of scrambled to fix that. And the scramble to fix that was based on the same kind of approach as we had initially developed the algorithm, which is based on intuition. right? Like it's like this seems right. This makes sense. You look at a bunch of different examples and you say, well, it doesn't fail there, right? And you look at alternatives, and you're like, well, it does fail there. It's like, okay, it's an intuition. It's an educated kind of guess, really, that this seems right, but it's not a proof. It's not. You don't have the rigor of a mathematical proof to say like that's correct. Which, you know, some of these in academic literature, consensus algorithms, they have these proofs of different properties like safety and liveness and stuff. Many adapted versions of this for blockchains don't. That's not necessarily the standard in blockchain. You know, they might talk about it in the white paper, but they don't have those proofs. So there wasn't. No, some are exceptions. Some do, you know, try to publish papers on that stuff. You know, I think of like the Casper paper, you know, the Ethereum people put out there. But anyway, that wasn't really the norm, or isn't still the norm, I would say. But anyway, we kind of patched up that issue and launched, and it's been working up to basically September 25th of last month. That was the legacy consensus running for years, and EOS has had 100% uptime. So it worked, but it still never had that guarantee that you would want in a mathematical proof that it really secures it against all these different edge cases. So that was one thing that I was really, you know, always in the back of my mind kind of sad about. It's like we could do so much better. But the other thing, of course, was not just on the proof side of things, but we could do so much better on other more practical things. Like the most obvious one being if we used aggregate signatures and we compress things to the number of votes compressed down to 1 in each block, we could make progress in this pipeline way per block. And that could shrink time to finality down to a very short amount. And I think more importantly, frankly, is that would not scale the way the legacy consensus scaled with producers. So in legacy consensus, if you say double the number of producers, 21 to 42, let's say, then you would double the time to true finality, or, you know, algorithmic finality, from 3 minutes to 6 minutes. So it's linearly scaling, which is terrible because let's say you wanted 1,000 producers. Now it's actually going to be really, really slow. With Savanna, we broke that dependence so that, you know, I'm not saying that there aren't other scaling aspects practically from engineering perspective. Think about from a theoretical perspective, it doesn't depend on the number of finalizers. So you could double it, you could quadruple it. It doesn't change the fundamental nature of like how quickly you can form the first phase and the next phase and get it done potentially in a second. So that was a really important property, not just for being fast, but also remaining fast, practically fast, even if we wanted to increase the number of finalizers for decentralization reasons, for example. And then there's other things as well, more subtle things, but like things where you have certain guarantees that I really wanted, didn't exist before with legacy consensus, does with Savanna, that if, you know, we hope that everyone's aligned and bad things are going to happen, like maliciously bad things aren't going to happen. As we saw, the legacy consensus was working just fine, you know, 100% uptime. That was great. But you want to know that if for some reason the finalizers, producers, whatever, decide they want to be malicious, that there are some guarantees you have on how we could punish them, that the algorithm can provide to you. Now this is a complicated thing where when you're talking about punishment, you're talking about economics, and the algorithms itself don't say anything about economics, right? Like the computer science of it doesn't say like, oh yeah, you'll lose $1 million if you do this bad thing. It doesn't work that way. But you could, if you build the right algorithms, you have the right hooks and the right properties to build a bigger mechanism on top that can bring in economics and therefore deterrence and therefore change your confidence in how likely something is to happen. But those basic hooks weren't there in the old one. But we made sure, as part of the design goals of the algorithm, to make sure that it does exist here, so that if that bad thing were to happen, you necessarily have the evidence you need to blame just the parties that are at fault, so that you can hopefully get the economic incentives aligned correctly.
So because we have the mathematical proofs this time, I know it was a goal to get it out before the stable release, but just due to meeting the deadline, we did not. But you'd mentioned like Casper, for example. They did the academic papers to actually showcase their mathematical proofs and algorithms. Cardano is known for all of their peer review and research. Could you go into a little bit of detail of like what the plans are now post-launch to put out an academic paper? Because one of the challenges for Brandon and I are, we know the talent of the engineering team. We know like your experience, and we could say Savanna Spring 1.0 is great. We got the best engineers working on it, but we can't articulate the nuts and bolts of it. There's very few people in the world that can. So even this academic paper I'm asking about, probably not that many people that will even understand it, but the ones who will understand it are the ones you want to, and you want feedback from, and hopefully some compliments from, ideally, and good feedback is the ultimate goal. So what are the plans currently for the academic paper? And I don't think we have a date for it, but what's the current status?
So let me kind of go back to this idea, back to the legacy consensus of, you got to make engineering requires trade-offs, right? And you ultimately care about putting out a good product. So there was that trade-off made that, again, I don't think it was wrong at the time. Made me feel bad, but wasn't necessarily the wrong business decision or just community decision to kind of do the best we could with the algorithm at the time, in the time we had, and launch in the appropriate time. Now, here we have another trade-off to make, right? Like there's the very academic focused approach where, deadlines, forget about deadlines. Like we're gonna publish the paper first. We're gonna do peer review. Who knows how long that'll take? Then we're gonna implement it, and or before that we might do a proof of concept, but like the actual implementation will follow after we've validated the theory of it from peer review. You're gonna be waiting years. At some point, like, people want fast finality now on EOS, right? We can't wait. We don't have that luxury. So
yeah,
there had to be a balance between those two approaches, I would say, right? The one where there's no mathematical rigor behind it at all, just based on intuition, but we rush it out. And then the very academic focus, like do it properly, get peer review, and then implement it, and years later you get to enjoy it. I think there was a healthy balance to be found there, and I think we found it, where there was a lot of rigor internally. There was an enormous demand of the mathematical analysis needed to be confident that what we're releasing is good. But the timing, and by the way, like we implemented things while we were changing the fundamental theory as we were learning. So that was, in some ways you could say that's not ideal. In other ways, that's the only way we could meet this deadline, and still get something that I could stand behind and say, yeah, there's, I have confidence in it because of the mathematical analysis. We learned a lot through that iteration process, and actually at one point, we improved the theory in ways like we went from a three-phase consensus to a two-phase consensus. Three-phase consensus was inherited from hot stuff. I can go into this. I'll go into this a little more. Let me in just a bit. Let me just wrap up on the academic paper thing, and then I'll go to that. So this balance, what we ended up with is earlier on sketch of proofs, and then later on a little bit more meat to it, where I could feel confident that it has the properties we want as part of this final production-ready implementation that we delivered in September, and is now active on EOS. It's working just fine. But I also don't want to say like that's good enough, right? I do still want to do what the ideal was, to put out the paper so that we could get peer review and we could get feedback on that. Because it's not like, if there is a problem, I want to know and we could fix it. We have another hard fork opportunity. Now, I'm pretty confident we're good, but you never know, right? That's what the peer review process is for. Also, just frankly, just documenting it properly so people know about it, and not just, it's not just
We believe
I mean,
there's
it'll be a little bit academic, but I'm hoping the paper. Yeah, go ahead.
To advance the industry, like putting out the academic paper and laying it out for the nerdiest people in the industry, let's say. Like, do you think there's something to be taken? I know we have the business source license on Spring 1.0 right now, so they couldn't necessarily copy the code and use it in a production environment. But from putting out the academic paper, are there things that could be learned by other academics or other engineers to advance maybe their own products because of what they could learn from this academic paper?
Yes, I think there's value for just engineers and the academics. So the paper, which is in process, I mean, so a lot of the hard work is done, but there's still more work to do in terms of actually cleaning up these proofs, making it something good, and then actually writing up all the stuff. So we're in that process now. It's, I mean, mostly, I'm doing that in addition to some other important things here at the NF. So
lots of hats.
But I'm trying to, I definitely want to get it out sooner rather than later. So that thing serves multiple purposes. One is like peer review on the fundamental theory of our algorithm. That's great, but it also captures the essence of this in a way that someone else could implement if they want for other purposes, blockchain or not, right? I mean, it's designed to have the rigor that, like, it's Byzantine fault tolerant. It has hash chains in there, so it probably makes the most sense for blockchain. But there's lots of wide variety of ways of designing blockchains that don't have to follow. It doesn't have to be decentralized, for example, and there's still value in, I think, BFT consensus. So I think it's more widely valuable than even blockchain. But yeah, that could be out there. People could take that. It's a lot of work to implement, as we've seen. So you definitely don't want to do it if you don't have to. But it might make sense to do so, because what the paper is going to capture in Savanna is the kind of core of Savanna, and there's lots of decisions that we made in adapting Savanna to the protocol that could have been done differently. So you have actually flexibility there, and you might want to do things a little differently. What we did in our adaptation made a lot of sense for us. I think it made lots of sense for any blockchain, but in some cases, they're adapting to things that people already expect in EOS, like half-second block times. Maybe in your system, you don't want a half-second block time. Maybe you want it to be longer, short, probably not shorter, but maybe variable. There's particular things that Savanna doesn't really care about, but it has to work with, like the proposer selection. So what I want to, this is also part of the work of the paper, is try to abstract out like all the stuff that doesn't matter to Savanna, that is specific to our protocol, to say, this is one option, but you could do other things. And here are the things you can do. As long as it's meeting this property, anything goes, anything's fine. It's just the minimum requirements are this. So you could adapt this to other particular protocols that choose proposers, the people, the entities creating blocks in different ways. So in our system, we didn't want to change too much. This is already a massive change to the protocol. We're changing the engine, the guts of it. We didn't want to change the way proposers or block producers are selected, or the way they rotate, from round to round. Those are all things that can be different and still be compatible with a Savanna protocol. It's just, So that's part of it that I want to, factor those things out so that people can look at this, what Savanna has to offer, and say, I could implement this in different ways than what we have done here. And there's obviously trade-offs there. But the other thing I think this provides value is, in addition to other documentation that I think will be appropriate, but as a separate reference, helping engineers figure out, how can I use these properties of Savanna? How can I use this to build IBC like clients and IBC stuff, right? Like the structure of how these proofs work will help guide the implementation of other tools and contracts and things like that have yet to, some of which already exist in some form that we're trying to prepare and get ready, but other things that don't exist, like if you did want to build, for example, a mechanism to lock tokens and have a withdrawal period and slash them if some bad behavior happened. How would you prove the bad behavior? So we can capture that in this paper, this documentation, so that people can understand, oh, okay, here's the rule violation that could occur that I could use as a slashing condition. So I think it provides value to even engineers like building products for EOS related to this potentially as well. But yeah, I mean, for me personally, it's like I want to put this out there. It's like you're not gonna go through all this C++ code necessarily to figure out what happens, but we could distill down what Savanna has to offer in a way that in some ways is less readable. Like a lot of engineers who are not academically focused will probably be like, I don't know what to do with this. But for many other people, they can read this and see what Savanna has to offer, and hopefully they'll appreciate it, and hopefully they'll also provide feedback.
And hopefully some of us or all of us will do our best job to annoy Vitalik until he potentially comments on it, or people of that caliber, which
that was
he in particular, he has commented on EOS multiple times over the years. So I don't see that outside of the realm of possibility. That is one of my intentions with this paper.
Sure. The critical flaw I mentioned early on to the deadline that we had to scramble to fix, that was reported by Vitalik. We just posted the issue on our GitHub.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we've talked about delays in a couple instances, and for the original EOS launch, how just getting it out the door to meet that deadline, some corners need to be cut, so to speak. They weren't critical necessarily. So we had some delays here. So one of our original launch dates that we set out previously was, I forget what the date was, sometime in July. And then our last day was a delay to what it ended up being late September. During that time frame, because of that delay, you actually made some very critical optimizations to the finality time. Yeah.
So as I said, like we started off with hot stuff as our inspiration, and there's lots of good write-ups by people from VMware. I don't know if they're still there. And a lot of them are academic types. They have blogs like talking about consensus algorithms. They write some good stuff, but one of them was kind of comparing these different, and they do in the papers too, the Hosta papers. They compare it to other algorithms like Tendermint and Casper, and talk about the different trade-offs they make. So there's a few, but there's a couple properties worth mentioning. So one is like the best case latency, and this is really, it's not about time, it's more about theoretically, like how many rounds, how many phases do you need in your algorithm? How many round trips do you need between the proposer and the finalizer before you can reach consensus? Is it one, which, there's some algorithms that do one, but they have other trade-offs that maybe aren't as good. But typically it's two. In hot stuff, it's three. So it's worse, right? Higher is worse. But why does it do that? So it does that because it does better in other metrics that it cares about, like responsiveness. So they compared Tendermint, which was not responsive, to hot stuff, which is responsive. And they say, well, we're paying a cost in the form of one extra round, but we're getting not only linearity, which is helping us scale, but also responsiveness, so that we're not assuming anything in this protocol about how much time we have to receive messages. We're moving as fast as we can, as fast as the network can. And if there's a failure that happens here, we can respond to it immediately and switch to a different proposer and finalize that. So that's a really nice property to have. And I didn't want to give that up. So, thinking through like 2 versus 3, given how fast these round trips are, we're talking about like 1 second versus 1.5 seconds. So I was thinking, okay, I think it's a worthwhile trade-off. I want to go with Hostuf's approach, get that, not just the linearity, but the responsiveness properties. And we'll have 3 rounds. That's okay. It's fast. 1.5 seconds is fast enough. But as we were developing hot stuff, or as we were developing the algorithm, we deviated further and further away from hot stuff. And one of the earlier on innovations was this idea. So in hot stuff, you're just voting on these generic messages, or there's different variants of it. There's basic hot stuff and there's chained hot stuff. We're doing something closer to the chain variant because we're leveraging our blockchain to provide the QC proofs and pipeline in that fashion. But anyway, in that chain hot stuff, they're basically voting on these proposals, these generic proposals. You can think of it as voting on the blocks, pretty much equivalent. And there's only one way they vote. In our system, we added this idea of a strong versus weak vote. And there was intuition there first, and then later on the proof came, months later. But the intuition there turned out to be right, that this is important in achieving responsiveness without some of the trade-offs that hot stuff have to do. So it's a way of signaling. The issue is, like, if everything's on a single chain, it's fine. You should be able to make progress. The problem is what happens if there's forks. If there's forks, you can end up with some partition of the network voting on this block and some other partition of the network voting on a conflicting block. And what you want to do is, if that happens, you want to make sure liveness is not lost, that they can eventually reconcile, get to agreement on a chain, and move forward. And it turned out, without getting too much detail, that the weak vote concept was really helpful in enabling that while remaining responsive. I'm still actually trying to formulate like the real detailed like ideas of this in a way I could explain with proofs and stuff. So I'm still, that's in progress, but it does seem pretty clear that was the benefit, and I didn't realize that until later. So with that in place, and we had iterated subtle details as well over time. So I was struggling actually with trying to prove the properties for a while. And then eventually we made some other change, and that finally unlocked the proof I needed. But then I realized the proof actually works with the way our system works. So we don't need 3 phases, and we can still get the liveness and safety properties we care about. Basically, I mean, it seems like there might be other trade-offs, right? That are like subtle details here that, as far as I can tell, don't matter for us. But for what we care about, we get the properties we want with 2 phases. Now, hot stuff to their credit does say, hey, there's a version of hot stuff that works with 2 phases, and we can compare that to other 2-phase commitment protocols like Tendermint and Casper, and they do that in their paper, which I think is wonderful. It's a great idea of like kind of unifying these different protocols and saying, under this same framework that we've established, hot stuff, we can interpret them. And that's great. But they admit that, like, well, with 2 phases, you have a weakness here where you have to assume a synchronous model. Your audience has to unnecessarily wait a certain period of time to ensure liveness, which then you're kind of being pessimistic, right? You're saying, I need to handle the worst case that I assume here for liveness, and therefore, in the best case, I'm also waiting that amount of time, and I'm not responsive. But we're able to be responsive and be able to get down to 2 phases, which means 1 second finality rather than 1.5 second finality. And that was actually discovered fairly late in the process, which, I mean, that was a nice side effect of the delay.
Nice benefit.
Actually allowed us to get
the 2-month delay. You get that benefit because if that optimization wasn't made, 1.5 seconds is still pretty good. The optimization probably would have never been made if we just released it in the original form.
I think I would still. I don't think I'd let that go. I'd probably look at it and be like, a couple months later, oh damn, we could have done this. We just would have had to wait until the next hard fork a year later to do it. Yeah.
All right, I took a chance at chatting with you, like in the midst of like your heads down phase. Not now, but during like I'm talking like 5-6 months ago, and I was like, I remember asking you if you could see the light at the end of the tunnel, and you had a really interesting response. You said, "I can see the light, but it is through a sequence of mirrors, so it is not a straightforward path to get out." I'm just wondering if you might want to say anything about like the work that you had to do, like getting through all these mathematical proofs, and did you enjoy it? Was it like an interesting challenge? What was that like, that whole process? And I know you had to adapt and change like as you went too, because like you said, you guys were adjusting the model as you went.
it was definitely an interesting and fun challenge. Also, wasn't all enjoyable, but it's a lot of diagrams of blocks, a lot of brain cycle spent trying to find this ridiculous edge case that disproves the, like, you know, if it's a false theorem, like if it's not a theorem, it's a false statement, you can't prove it. So you try hard, you can't prove it. But if you get lucky, you might find the counterexample, and then you're done. And, you know, there's no time, there's no need to spend more time on that. So there was a lot of trying to find counterexamples, these really ridiculous edge cases that probably would never happen in reality unless you actually had a compromised, like a malicious actor controlling time, right? Precisely of when a block is produced, when, like, controlled exactly when blocks and votes are delayed. But in theory, it's possible, and that theory then proves that your current algorithm is no good in terms of meeting these properties. So then you learn from that and say, well, okay, how do I prevent that case? And you realize I got to make this tweak to the algorithm. So then I have a new algorithm, and you're like, maybe this will work. Maybe I could prove this. You try again, same situation. You eventually find another counterexample. And it's not just me doing this, right? Like, presenting the new iteration of it as a team in our whiteboards. We draw lots of blocks, and, you know, someone pipes up like, well, what about that case? And we walk through it. No, that's fine. It's like, what about that case? And then we walk through and like, oh, wow, yeah, you found it. You found the counterexample. So it's lots of iterations of that until eventually we got to the point where it seems to work, and it seems to work because we could finally prove it. Right? Like that was the process.
So in this case, the counterexample is like the thing that proves it's not complete,
Right.
essentially, that there's and people have said that you're extremely good at finding like really random edge cases and corner cases. And I'm sure the whole team has gotten like great calisthenics on that front at this point.
So we spent a lot of time talking about how we got here, about like what instant finality delivers, but with each release, we're always releasing, I guess, foundational pieces for the next step. So an example would be Leap 5.0, BSL signatures were integrated. We didn't activate them immediately on EOS, at least, but then that came in handy because it was foundational to instant finality in Spring 1.0. So what are some of the features that are baked into Spring 1.0 in Savanna that are foundational to kind of the next steps? So like there's some unique properties that you created. So block producer it's bundled together as a block producer still, same as it was, but it's technically separated into multiple pieces. Like what could you do with that, for example? And what other nuggets are built or inside of Spring that maybe we haven't talked about that are kind of building blocks for future things that you would like to do to improve the protocol?
Yeah, okay, I'll talk about the block proposer finalizer split probably last. So I'll talk about some other ones. So we rebuilt, like Legacy Consensus had this idea of a Merkle tree over all the history, so you can easily prove in logarithmic space and time, prove some historical block. So if you prove this block is final, you could prove some historical block is final. That's fine. That was all good. We changed how that works. Won't go into the details, but still have the ability to do this. We still have sparse validation possible, meaning a light client can start off with like the genesis, we call it finalizer policies. It's basically the set of finalizers currently active at this time, plus a threshold, but we get into that. And then that could change, right? So there's mechanisms, we don't have the light clients yet, but there's mechanisms in which you could have a proper full node, talk to the light client and provide proofs to go from this policy and jump straight to the next policy. So the next time BP rotation happens or a finalizer changes their key or something, that changes the policy to a new one. And so you got to jump from policy to policy and not break that chain of trust, right? Because this policy is giving you essentially the next policy, and that's the reason you believe it is because the previous one said it so, and the next one is saying so for the next one. And so it's important to not break that chain of trust. But the key thing here is that the light client doesn't need to process every block or even every block header. It can jump. Now that was technically part of the legacy consensus as well. We made sure to maintain that. But anyway, that is a key kind of foundational piece we wanted to make sure we have, because that enables fast syncing of light clients to get up to date with the most recent finalizer policy. And then when you have the most recent finalizer policy, you're able to use that to prove any block that uses that most recent finalizer policy. And when you prove a block that uses that, when you prove a block final, you could use that block you prove in final to prove all prior blocks final in a lighter way through Merkle branches. So that whole mechanism exists. We've actually already started using that in the form of IBC contract. So that's how you could do proofs of, that's how you can keep the IBC contract up to date, so that anyone could prove, also using the same kind of finality proofs, that a block is not only final, but that then within that block, some things happened. So we plug into that proof system, like that proof tree, the Merkle tree. We have other hashes of other Merkle trees. So you have the action Merkle tree in there. So that allows you to prove this particular action happened in this block. And so that's critical for IBC, for example. And the thing we also made sure to have room for there, it's not implemented yet, is we want to make sure we can also put other kinds of commitments in that same structure, so you can prove other things about that block. So one example is a state proof, which EOS doesn't have right now, but the idea is we have the foundation to build these state commitments and put them in there and prove not just that an action occurred in the block, but also what is some arbitrary state as of the end of that block. So you process the block, you have some state, I want to prove some part of that state. We could do that, and actually we took effort to make sure we do that in a way that doesn't require us to generate that commitment at the time that we build that block. We could do it later. We could pipeline it. Again, we're pipelining as much as we can. So in some other blockchains, they have state proofs, but they require calculating it at the end of that block and including it in the block header that's signed. So you have it right there, but that takes time. And so we wanted to make sure that we could decouple that, so we could actually do that in parallel, if along with block processing. So you could process the next block, which happens right after, right? And if you think about it, you have a proposer, it's as a half second, actually a little less window of time to produce their block. And then right after they produce the next block, right after they produce the next block. So we want to make sure that, like, while they're producing the next block, they could spend time computing the state commitment of the previous block, and then have it in time so that they can commit to it in later blocks. This is kind of delayed pipeline fashion. So we were thinking about how can we optimize that state proof generation as part of the protocol, right? The protocol is designed to enable that kind of delay, so that you could do the engineering of the state proofs more efficiently and still achieve the properties you want, which is when a block is considered final, you're able to prove the state of that final block. You don't have to, it's as of that final block, you can prove it. So that's one thing that, again, it's not ready yet, but we're already thinking ahead about how would we actually not just do it, but like the engineering considerations of doing it. How can we better facilitate that as part of the consensus algorithm?
Before you move on from state proofs, could you just briefly say what state proofs enable?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so a few things. They so instead of trust, so right now you could like start a node from a snapshot, and there's different places to acquire a snapshot. You could generate your own, but you have to trust the integrity of the snapshot. You have to trust where it came from. You could, it's a deterministic thing. Like you could take the hash of it and compare it. It's the same version, obviously different versions have different hashes, but it's the same version. We take take effort to make sure that you could like compare the hashes across different snapshots generated at the same block. So you could compare and say, hey, did you get the same snapshot? I want to make sure I don't have the wrong thing, right? You can sign it if you want. But anyway, however out of band means you have of verifying if the right snapshot, you then take it and load it up. And if it's not good, like if someone's manipulated something, you're just going to blindly accept that. And you might later realize that because, you know, you're trying to spend money you think you have, but you don't have. And then the rest of the network says, you don't have that. The transaction is invalid. But it'd be nice to know that you don't start off with bad state. So again, right now it's just, you know, there's different mechanisms. There's different ways people could just have confidence they got the right snapshot. Would I'd like us to get to is to rely on the existing consensus algorithm you already trust, right? The finalizers you already trust to reach finality and to produce the chain in case of the proposers. You could rely on their attestation of finality via state proofs, also an attestation of the validity of that state in a way that can be proven. And therefore you could actually validate the snapshot, state of the snapshot, without having to trust the source of that snapshot. You would just rely on your trust in the quorum of finalizers of the network. And in fact, when you could do that, you could even automate the snapshot loading process so that you can actually get it from the peer-to-peer network rather than downloading it from some website. And so that can actually improve the node operator experience as well. Like just the idea of I launch a node, I want to bootstrap it, use the light client mechanism I talked about to very quickly synchronize to the beginning. So like from wherever, it doesn't matter, like wherever you start with, you could then very quickly as a light client synchronize these sparse proofs to the very recent finalizer policy and block. So you could prove everything backwards if you wanted to. But then you could use that to prove the state, the most recent state that you can now grab from the network, load up that state. And then once you have done that, you can then synchronize going forward. So that could all be something, it's not implemented, but like that could all be implemented once we have state proofs to really make the process of joining a node into the network a lot easier.
That sounds like a major upgrade.
Just
so
to give a concrete example of like how things were. So I guess prior to EOS having a foundation, the core development team never really, they didn't put out official snapshots, so to speak. Whereas a lot of other chains, like if you wanted to snapshot the chain, the foundation or the core development team would often put out, I guess, official snapshots. And those ones, a centralized exchange, for example, might trust enough if they're spinning up a node to start from that snapshot. With EOS, without a snapshot, from what I understand, it takes weeks to run the entire chain history from Genesis. So starting from a snapshot.
That's your hardware, but yeah, to give you more, it's years of data that are not like, you know, it's not like Bitcoin, right? You have periods of time where there was enormous
to play through.
Yeah, like there are periods of times where we're doing a lot of transactions per second sustained for a while. You got to crunch through all that
per day during IDOS for 3-4 months. Great. So I know all of the infrastructure guys hate replaying that part of the chain.
Right.
So by having this peer-to-peer snapshotting, essentially, you don't have to go on GitHub and download a trusted snapshot, because that's basically what a lot of other chains do. Is it's a trusted snapshot. If it's the foundation or team or someone very high reputation putting out that snapshot, you could trust it to a pretty fair extent. But this would be basically the protocol itself would basically give you the output of the snapshot, and it's already validated, trusted.
Right.
That's cool.
Right. So, for example, right now, there might be some BPs, right? That you're like, okay, they're high-ranking BPs. Yeah. I trust them. You get it from their website. But what would be better is not just one BP, but all BPs, or like 15 out of 21 BPs, agree on this snapshot. That's effectively the trust model there. But it's not just that. It's like it's the same mechanism you already rely on for finality. So if they were manipulating things there, they would also necessarily be manipulating things on the chain, which has repercussions. So there's an incentive there to be aligned, and that's why you have even more confidence in it.
That's maybe a good. Yeah, same segue, I think.
One final thing on like the light client. So EOS nodes, as they stand today, are quite heavy. I mean, it's a trade-off of how you want to basically approach your chain itself. So like Ethereum, for example, you could run nodes very light, but then you have the scalability issues of Ethereum. But anyone could run a node. You don't have to have like commercial hardware necessarily to do that. EOS, you need a fairly significant hardware setup to be able to run a full EOS node. So if you're a block producer and you're in a paid position, you're getting incentivized by the network, the cost kind of makes more sense. But then there's other use cases for who would have to run a node. So an application, for example, like an application like Upland, they have to run full nodes. So with these light clients, would that allow a dApp developer who currently has to run a full EOS node, the same full node that a block producer would run, that they're getting paid to run, but they're basically running it out of pocket? Would the light client be a replacement for a dApp running their own infrastructure?
The answer is complicated. So one thing that could help is, potentially if you were to shard the state across multiple chains and they communicate with IBC, that's one way of reducing the load. So you can focus on your application and not all the other shards of it. They're all able to communicate very, very fast, right? 1 second between each other to kind of give a cohesive experience. That's one option. But let's say you're just focused on this one chain and it's pretty heavy and you want to find ways to make that lighter for you. So there's lots of ideas about fancy things you might be able to do, but without getting too speculative, if you want to run arbitrary speculative transactions, most likely in the form of a read, you want to read some state for your application, you do need the state. Actually, so there is another benefit of state proofs that I haven't gone into that maybe changes that a little bit. I'll get to that in a moment. But you really want, typically, you want your own node that you could talk to and ask, send an arbitrary transaction to read some state and get a response back and have trust in it, so that you could implement your backend or your front end or whatever application logic. So you need state there. And to get state, you need to process the blocks and do validation and actually do the state transitions and all that. So that's the heavy stuff that people are trying to avoid. If all you care about, though, is events that have occurred, actions, and so there's the read pat and the write pat, right? The read pat is, I just care about actions. I don't care about the state. So any state that I care about is represented through an action, inline action in my contract. In that case, you can actually prove the events. There has to be some node out there that indexes the stuff. So it's not like it's completely free, right? But they could scale that out for multiple clients potentially, and there might be some economies of scale there where they say, you say, I'm interested in this action, and it provides you that action with proof. So you don't have to trust them. And then you can just rely on that stream of events. For example, maybe they're transfer events. Maybe you're an exchange and you're interested in the transfer events that deal with you. Obviously, you just don't want to blindly trust them. You want proof that this actually happened. And then now you could handle the deposit side of your application. Now, what about the write side? What about withdrawals? Well, you still need speculative transactions for that. So you need to craft the transaction and send it out. But also, you don't need to run those nodes. You know what transaction to create. That's not hard, right? I need to send this much EOS from my account to this account because they put that in the memo or something like that. So you can craft that transaction, sign it, and send it to another node in the network process. So you could offload all of that, and in theory, you could have a very light system that can handle, say, deposits and withdrawals for an exchange, and they don't have to run a full node. And the important part is it's secure. That's one example, but you can imagine generalizing this to other applications. It's when you need arbitrary state lookups independent of actually submitting a transaction to the network, where you're gonna need to know with the state available, and that's the heavy part. The part I said maybe not is the other thing state proofs could do, which is we could actually have the reads of state come back with proofs. If you have state proofs, you could do that. So you can imagine I'm querying a table, and instead of just giving the response back, which is what it does now, you could give the response back with some Merkle branch to the state proof that you still have a light client, right, where you're synchronizing and keeping up to date with the most up-to-date blocks in a sparse way. And you use that as your root of trust to then validate the Merkle branch proofs of state as of some block. And that way, you don't just get back the result, you get back the result justified by a proof. So now you don't have to trust the API node you're talking to, and still everything works fine. So that's another potential feature that could be implemented if we had state proofs, and that could allow you to further offload. Now, again, someone's doing the work, but you don't have to run the nodes for that. You could offload that to someone else to do the reads for you and send it back to you with proof, and you validate the proof. So there's overhead there, but the point is that's a strategy that can allow you to not bother running a node, let someone else do it, but also not having to trust who you're talking to, which is a really powerful concept.
Yeah, it seems like hugely advantageous to have that for the network, especially when you mentioned exchanges being able to get proof for transactions running a light client. I think that would be enormously beneficial.
And that's something that works with, that's something that could work with the current protocol. If all you care about is the actions and not the state, we already have the mechanisms to do that. There's some implementation details on the light client side, but it wouldn't require a hard fork to enable that.
Got it. You were kind of hinting at, or we did kind of get into the potential recomposition of the BP role, and that kind of also dovetails into, I'd imagine, state proofs to some extent, or the ability for some BPs to be handling a different load, maybe. I don't know if you want to get into like the theoretical or.
I see what you're getting to. So first, let me just talk about the decoupling, the advantages there. So with Savanna, we also decoupled these roles of proposing a block, of taking the transactions and putting them into a block in a particular order, and finalizing a block, which is basically voting on a block, these strong or weak votes, which are signatures on the block you send to the proposer, so that they can aggregate those votes together into a single BLS aggregate signature, which is the quorum certificate, and then include that in the next block to justify their claim. So the way it works is you have multiple phases in Savanna, and the phases involve claims. So like if you have a block that claims another block, and that block claims another block, this block that gets finalized, assuming this is a strong claim and this is weak or strong claim, this block, the other block gets finalized as part of this chain. And in order to justify those claims, that's where you attach to the block the quorum certificate. So the block proposers are responsible for both proposing the block, but also collecting the votes from the finalizers to create these quorum certificates. The finalizer's only responsibility is they receive the block and they vote on it. Now, they also validate it. So this is the other part of, this is one of the parts of Savanna, the acronym, validated editions, the V in Savanna. We want to make sure that the finalizers attestation, which is the last A in Savanna, is not just helping you reach finality, like helping us determine when the block is final, but also at the same time serves as an attestation that the blockchain up to that point, up to that last final block, is valid. So that means that the finalizers have to validate these blocks as well, and then vote on them. So those are the two different roles. In legacy consensus, those two roles were combined into one, just the producer. The producer produced the blocks, but they also voted on it in the form of their producer signature of the block. That served double duty of both signing the block header, so like you could trust that this is a block worth processing, like you're not going to waste your time. As like if you didn't have the producer signature, you would potentially get blocks from bad actors who would say, "Hey, spend your time processing this block, just waste it." Right? So that's what that protection is there for. It's just to make sure you're not wasting your time on irrelevant blocks. So that served one purpose. The other purpose it served was these votes for consensus. So we've decoupled that. So the votes for consensus now come not through the producer signature, but through these BLS finalizer signatures instead. So two separate things. There's advantages to doing that, that decoupling. But like for now, in order to not make too many changes happen, we decided not at the algorithm level, but at the higher level of the system contracts to recouple those together. So the VPs have to serve both. They have to have two hats on, right? There's two different roles, but they have to wear the hat of a proposer and wear the hat of a finalizer. And they could separate these out to two different nodes, actually. They don't have to put on the same machine. But it's the same entity responsible for it. And the reason we did that is just because we didn't want to make too many changes, and there's already a mechanism to pay VPs for proposing blocks. And you want someone to be responsible for finalizing blocks. And without completely changing the economics of how these different entities get paid, it just makes sense to couple them so that you're getting paid for the joint job of proposing and finalizing the block. Okay, but there could be some advantages to separating them out, which is something that we can still do. Like Savanna enables that. It would be a system contract change basically to decouple them again, or decouple them for the first time. So you might there might be a benefit in keeping. So for the sake of decentralization, you want multiple entities in both of these roles, but there might actually be a benefit in keeping the number of proposers, having fewer proposers than having finalizers. Because ultimately what matters is finality. And you do want to make sure there's at least honest proposers out there, but the thresholds are different. You basically, if you had sufficient honest finalizers, like the number of Byzantine faults was below the threshold that we support, then as long as you have one honest proposer, finality could move forward and your transactions wouldn't be censored, right? You just need one honest proposer, one of N, or let's say one of P being the number of proposers. For finality to not have a similar issue, you need to meet a different threshold T of F being the number of finalizers. And that threshold is basically 2/3 is how we've configured it. It's actually configurable in Savanna, but I think that makes sense to maximize the worst case type of fault is to pick 2/3. So you need, to make it more concrete, if we have 21 finalizers, you need 15 of the 21 finalizers to be honest and available so that finality can progress. And if they weren't, then you could imagine you had 7. Is it 7? Yeah, 7 of the 21 who were deciding to be malicious and collude. They could hold up chain hostage and say, I don't want to finalize this block because I don't like it for some reason, for whatever reason. But if you give me this block, I'll finalize that. So they ultimately get the final say of what becomes part of the canonical chain. And that's 15, or the threshold is like 1/3 of the 21 basically. So 7 out of 21 that could do that. So it would be nice to scale that up for greater decentralization. But even if you keep the 21, or even if you reduce it to like 5 for the proposers, you just need one honest finalizer. So it's a 1 of P that you need there, whereas here you need a 2/3 of F. So it's different thresholds. So it could make sense to have more finalizers, but you don't necessarily need more proposers. And you say, well, why not? Why not have both? Well, there's costs to this stuff, right? So there's a cost to being a proposer, to having a beefy enough machine that you can quickly process transactions, all that state and RAM that you need to have. So you don't necessarily want to have more than necessary. But finalizers also have to cover these costs too, right? So why not just have the same number of proposers as finalizers if they're the same nodes? There is a possibility that there's ways we could optimize validation so that it's actually cheaper in terms of processing than proposing. So proposing, you absolutely need the state because you don't know what the transaction is going to do. The transaction might randomly decide to pick up this state or that state, and you need to be ready for anything. But for finalization, you know the transaction is fixed in its behavior. You know it's going to look up this record and this record and this record. It's not going to do anything else because it's deterministic, and you've already decided what it's going to do. You've fixed the order. So there's an opportunity, and I guess so. This is where it relates to state proofs. I think is what you're getting at. Is there's a possibility you could augment the block with some of the state that a transaction accesses with proofs, so that you know it's not being manipulated, and use that to validate the block without having all of the state. So having a subset of the state, because some of the state is provided as part of the block. And so if you could do that, you could end up having lighter nodes. It's not a light node, but it's a lighter node that maybe has less RAM requirements and could even maybe process some things in parallel, because if you know the inputs, if you already cached the inputs, you could run them in parallel to just make sure they all stitch together nicely. You don't actually have to go in order. So there's all kinds of optimizations you could do if you had that could make processing a block faster and require validating a block faster and require less storage. In which case, the finalizer's job becomes easier, and you could scale that out more cheaply than the more expensive proposers. So that's the idea there, basically. Even if you didn't do that, there might still be advantages to having less proposers than finalizers, because proposers have a decent amount. I mean, in some ways, I said finalizers are more powerful. They decide what becomes the chain, and they have that ultimate authority. But proposers also have powers like deciding exactly what your CPU time is billed for your transaction, or ordering the transactions, right? Or but also just being available. Like, are they available? If they're down during their round, where they're down, you don't produce any blocks. You just, your transaction has to wait 6 seconds before it has the other opportunity if that proposer's down. Whereas with finalizers, it's okay if few of them are down. We could support some threshold F can be down and we're still good. And so we have a lot more tolerance there because of how that works than with, say, a proposer. We have tolerance in proposers as well. You just have to pay in time, right? So even if all but one of them go down, as I said, or are malicious, you could still work, but you might have to wait a long time before that one proposer comes back around. And there are improvements we could do for this that we thought about that, again, wasn't in scope for Spring 1.0 because it's just too many changes. But there's ways you could kind of change the ordering. Instead of going to fixed round robin order, you could maybe shuffle things around automatically if, for example, some proposer that's supposed to be scheduled at this time slot wasn't available. So there's things we could do there. But as it stands now, you might have to wait a long time before it gets around to that proposer. So you might want to be stricter on the proposers so that they're like the highest quality, right? If you expand it, you might, if you rank things on the highest quality PPs or proposers, the more you go, the more likely you are to have some that are maybe less available. So you might want to optimize and say, actually, I want to shrink it down to the best, but that's still decentralized enough. There's a trade-off there. But on the finalizer side, it's not this case that it's more the merrier, but there's a lot more tolerance there, and the trade-off there might be different. So decoupling allows us to make two different trade-offs. We're not forced to make the same number for both. We could say for BPs, the trade-off here that's optimal is this. For finalizers, the trade-off that's optimal is this much larger number. So that gives us the flexibility to do that.
Very cool. Thanks for explaining that. I think that's the best explanation so far. I've heard of some of the benefits and trade-offs for decoupling that role. In addition to state proofs, and I can't remember what else was mentioned right off the top of my head right now, but was there anything else that you wanted to mention or thought was maybe worth bringing up looking forward in terms of what Spring and Savanna enables? Yeah,
so the other thing that I did mention, maybe I kind of referred to in terms of properties that you have if a finality violation occurred, but I would like to talk just briefly about that a little bit. So one of the properties that we aim to achieve was if a finality violation occurs, first of all, that there's these rules. There's 3 rules. I just call them rule 1, 2, 3, but there's a short description I can give to each that the finalizers must follow. And basically, as long as they follow those rules, they're not going to contribute towards a finality violation. And in fact, you could show the converse of if there was a finality violation, then enough, and by enough I mean more than the fault tolerant threshold, so more than F, let's say, enough of the finalizers have broken at least one of those rules. So these are part of the proofs, right? Like those are the properties we have. So we could say that if a finality violation occurs, that more than F finalizers have broken one of these three rules. So that's a nice property to have. The other thing that was a nice property to have that we made sure we have is that if you have a finality violation and you have two different chains that are conflicting, if you have both chains, then there's necessarily enough information in those two chains for you to construct a proof that shows that rule violation that occurred and blame it on the appropriate parties who've broken the rules and not anyone else who didn't break the rules. So that's another critical property that we have in this algorithm. And so what that allows is imagine you have this sort of black mark you could put against a finalizer, right? And you have an automated contract that can do that. If you could prove to it that one of these rules has been broken by that finalizer. And we actually built that contract. It's part of our we're actually in the process of reviewing it, but it's in a PR right now. We built that contract as part of our tests so that we can actually validate this actually works. It's not just theoretical. Now, it doesn't do anything. It's just a mark to say, like, yeah, they broke the rules. But the point is that the proofs, those cryptographic proofs, not mathematical proofs in this case, but like these cryptographic proofs can be validated to verify that you broke one of these rules. And the mathematical proofs guarantee that we could generate those cryptographic proofs if a finality violation occurred. There's enough information to do that. So bringing those two together, you're able to build a contract that so then we got to cover, like, if you had a light client, what information would you have to store? Those are details I don't want to get into. But in short, you have a light client that could store information as it's doing its thing, and it's being convinced that some things are final, and it's reacting to that. For example, it might think, oh, okay, I received some EOS, let me send you some Bitcoin on the Bitcoin chain, or something like that, some irreversible action that happens outside of the EOS blockchain. It's reacting to. And then later on, it realizes, oh, I was tricked. That wasn't the canonical chain. That was some other fake chain I was tricked into. If that happens, then what this theory says is that we have enough information in the real chain, because eventually it'll realize it's tricked because it can realize there's a real chain. So then using the information it's stored and using the information in the real chain, it can actually construct the cryptographic proof that blames just the people that were at fault for creating that fake chain in the first place. And so then you have a mechanism where you could punish the bad actors in the network. And that's a critical part of the deterrence for the security, for greater security of the system. So right now, like there's already incentives to not do these bad things, because you want to continue getting paid, you want to continue having those privileges as the block producer. But on top of that, it'd be nice to be able to have an arbitrarily scaled kind of cost if you did something, if you broke the rules. So you could then take that basic verification mechanism and couple it with a time lock staking pool, right? Where in order to become a finalizer, you might require locking up some tokens for some period of time. And if you ever want to stop becoming a finalizer, or if you ever unlock those tokens, you automatically stop becoming a finalizer. And you have to wait like 2-3 weeks or a month or something. Like say 3 weeks. You have to wait 3 weeks before those tokens are available. And during that time, if at any time someone proves to you objectively that you broke the rules, your funds are slashed. So that creates a stronger economic alignment where you can now put a dollar amount or EOS amount or whatever for how many tokens are at stake to be lost if these finalizers broke the rules.
Very cool. I guess we'll have to see how that plays out, and that's an interesting potential application. I guess, what do you see as the main upside of that addition for finalizers, besides just like the deterrence? Do you see it as like a necessary, or
I don't view it as necessary. It's a nice to have. Obviously, things have been working well without that, and there's other. So that's where we get to the consensus mechanism part, where there are these hard guarantees. It's not a computer science problem. It's a economics and social problem, right? Of what acts as good deterrents, and there's obviously already existing deterrents for bad behavior on the system, and it works pretty well. But this is an additional mechanism that just adds on top other things where you can scale it. You can say, like, well, I want to put a dollar amount on how much they're going to have to lose. Mm-hmm. This mechanism allows you to do that, which is a nice property. Is it needed? Probably. I don't know. It doesn't seem necessary so far. But again, these are the kinds of things of security, of like, you don't know if it's needed or not until something bad happens, I guess.
Yeah. Well, cool. I know we're pushing our limits here on time. Areg, it's been a pleasure. It's always great to have you on and be able to get deep into some of these topics we can't always broach. As Zach said, we certainly can't tease this stuff out without people like you and the other engineers being able to speak on the topic. So thanks so much for your time and joining us. I don't know if there's any final thoughts you wanted to share, just about, doesn't necessarily have to be about the future, but just kind of.
No, I mean, this was a long time in the making, so I'm glad, we got Savanna out there, Spring 1.0, and it's working, and it went very smoothly. That was all part of this hard work of lots of testing and iteration that went into it to make everything work so smoothly. So I'm really happy that it all went well. We talked during this call about all kinds of things that Savanna could enable. And some of those things, I mean, these things are speculative, right? It doesn't mean we're doing them. There are things we could do. Although I'm hopeful maybe some of these things we might be able to get to. But then there's also other things unrelated to Savanna that I'm excited about working on next too. So there's so much still to come with Spring and this protocol in EOS. Interesting technical innovations, right?
Anything in the unrelated category you want to tease, or too much to get into right now? Is that part two?
I don't know how much. So I don't know how much of this we're going to do or not do, but it's. I'll just say it's in the area of better composability, better developer experience, and then. Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of stuff. Probably don't have time to get into these things now.
All right, we'll save that for another deep dive. Zach, any other final thoughts?
Nope. I'm gonna have to actually listen to this again to understand a lot of it, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, me too.
Very, very, very detailed. For a technical audience, they're probably going to enjoy this a lot.
Yeah.
Other normal people might have to. Usually, when I watch videos, I watch them on podcast 1.5x, sometimes 2x if they talk slow. I don't think many people get to do it on this one.
Yeah, no. Well, yeah. I mean, we're probably rare people that like to geek out about state proofs and what they mean, but yeah, a huge congratulations from me, and of course, I'm sure everyone feels similarly like you and the rest of the engineering team at the ENF, and Guillaume and Kevin and everybody else that contributed. This has been a major undertaking, and a big congratulations there.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll do it again sometime. And so until then, we'll see y'all at the next fireside chat. Thanks again for being here, Arik and Zach.
Thank you.
Ciao for now.